Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. With a heavy heart, Kronan the Destroyer, boss of the Nose-Splitter tribe, went to his most sacred of all spots, his sanctum sanctorum, his axis mundi. Atop a ridge, he looked down at the valley which he ruled with an iron fist. He was about to embark on a pathway he never thought he would tread, a dark walkway to folly. But he now had no choice, for he had to obey the great prophet. Kronan sat heavily and prepared himself. He was about to perform an activity that had spelt doom and destruction to countless empires, civilizations, and races since the dawn of time. He was about to think. He reached for his thinking grot and, after a small amount of structural rearrangement, he donned the headpiece that would ease his way into this dark domain. For Kronan had heard the prophet, not just listened. He had truly heard him. The days after the meeting of the big boss bash, where the prophet had spoken, stayed with him. It was a moment of epiphany for Kronan. He did not know if the legendary prophet was speaking the words of Gork or of Mork, or of both. But they had the ring of the gods about them. He had been told how the race of Orks had been very good at brutality, but had forgotten their heritage, had ignored half of their own lives, their own culture, their own religion. They had forgotten cunning. The prophet went on to remind them how the gods were of brutal cunning and cunning brutality, but then asked all that were there how often they had heard these words. All looked on in amazement, aghast at the revelation. They had all been brutal, but when was the last time they had been cunning? How the prophet now challenged them all, from highest to lowest, to not only do the brutal thing, as it was the right thing for all true Orks to do, but also to do the cunning thing, as all Orks should do. Divine words. A terrifying concept, to change their entire way of life, but it was as the gods had demanded. So Kronan researched the best ways to be cunning. He had often heard how smart the humies were, so he studied them. His long and laborious hour of concentration brought him to an unimpeachable decision. Cunning resided in hats. All of the most clever humies wore large hats, headgear worthy of cunning. Thus did Kronan choose his thinking grot well. Longer limbs for tying into position, and not a squealer, also for the tying into position. Prepared as he was in his thinking spot with his thinking grot, Kronan began to think. There was a regular patrol in force from the humies. They would have metal boxes and marines. The boxes kept his boys away from the marines due to the phenomenal darker the boxes provided, but when closed upon, the marines in blue would stand in orderly lines and keep his boys away from the boxes. He required cunning to solve this issue. So he scrunched up his eyes and continued to think. Release the cunning within. Release the cunning within. Kronan sighed, reached up, and took down his thinking grot. It was trying too hard, and the whispering was distracting. so Kronan bit the arm off the grot and slowly munched. The relaxing chewing did seem to be improving matters, also the struggling and writhing from his previous headgear, but the high-pitched screaming was not conducive to the process, so Kronan finished the job by crushing its head. The grot went still as its skull shattered beneath his grip. Between the slow hypnotic dangling of the grot from his fist, the relaxation of the chewing, and the obvious benefit of the location, Kronan began to see the way forward. He truly felt blessed by Gork and Mork. The prophet was very good at his job, it would seem. He and his boys would be ready for the next patrol. The tank column trundled down the valley as it always did. Kronan, with his newfound God-given abilities, considered that they might just be looking for a scrap to kill boys. No idea why, but it did not matter now. He would have those boxes very soon, and with them he would then take the nearest Humi cities. They always opened the door to Humi boxes. Kronan smirked. As they reached the middle point of the valley, he raised his weapon high and signaled the attack. Orks thundered down the valley towards the Marines and were quickly amongst them, for the fire from their boxes was not coming. Lines of a strange energy flashed between points in the forest and the tanks, seeming to pass straight through the metal exterior and go somehow inside. As the Marines had no supporting fire, their demise was swift, their orderly lines crushed under the tide of green. Kronan walked to the vehicles. As he got closer, he saw that they were shaking and juddering, like there was something happening inside of a hectic nature. Suppressed gunfire could be heard from within on occasion, but this was becoming less and less as the lines of power kept striking them. Kronan walked to the hatches and could see that some form of fluid was running between some of the nuts and bolts. The hatches not quite snug enough. The fluid was an acrid fecal brew and seeped out swiftly, but then it changed to become more solid and more green. Blood. Snot blood. The swaying in the vehicle seemed to slow and then stop. Kronan dropped his hand, and the lines of power ceased as one. Pulling hard on one of the hatches, Kronan saw it fly off, and an ocean of diminutive dead green bodies flooded out. But amongst them were some pink bodies, with lots of red smears. So many snots had been sent through that they had packed the vehicle and crushed all inside to death. It would take some time to clear away the snots, but that is what grots were for. Well, other than thinking, of course. It was a good day. Kronan felt he had been truly orky today. Not only had he been brutal, but he had also managed to be cunning. Kronan would soon have multiple Humi tanks looted and ready to go. Perhaps this cunning thing might just be worth it, after all. Kronan walked purposefully along the trail to that most sacred of spots yet again. It had been an eventful week, possibly the most eventful of his life. Well, apart from the time he killed and ate the previous boss and all of his knobs, of course. But that was some time ago now, and Kronan was sure that this week would eclipse even that great moment. Well, he would if he knew what an eclipse was, of course. But the point is the same. Let us not prevaricate over the vernacular deployed, eh? Kronan did not trudge as he had before, the time he had come to this holy site to perform this titanic deed. It was unknown to him then. It was esoteric, to be feared. But things were different now. For Kronan had gone up in the world since his victory over the Humis and the metal boxes. He had used that most holy of things, his faith in Gork and Mork, to permit him the foresight, the genius, the cunning, to resolve the issue that had been plaguing his tribe for many a moon. The riddle of the boxes. Using the shock attack guns, he had resolved the riddle and had cracked the nut, had defeated the Humis with cunning. And so it was that as the glory of his victories over the Humis had spread far and wide, a miracle had happened. Truly, Kronan was blessed by the gods. For 3 of the local tribes had arrived. There had been much excitement as each made their way to the valley. for it was hoped by all that a huge scrap was in the offing. Many were disappointed, initially only of course, that they could not scrap with each other, but when the bosses met and each in turn held Kronan as the Kunnin, they would follow him in his efforts against the Humis. For where one victory was gained, surely more were in the offing, and as much as the boys did love to fight each other, that was as nothing compared to the joy of fighting and beating the Humis. And so, hailed as the boss of 4 tribes now, Kronan went to sleep, both surprised and slightly concerned, if such an emotion could be considered appropriate to any orc. Perhaps perplexed would be a better description. For one thing foxed Kronan, when he happily but wearily retired for the evening. How in the name of Gorkamok was he going to find more Kunnin? He was uncertain if he could repeat the supreme display, but after expelling excess grub and voiding his bowels, Kronan decided it was an issue for the morning. And so, as the morning came, Kronan awoke as he had never awoken to a morn before. He was now the boss of 4 tribes, had literally tripled or more his power in the one feast. His mind was aware with things he had not really been aware of before. Ideas. He barely remembered the word. It was used by the prophet at the big boss bash. Kronan knew it had something to do with Kunnin. He was now ready. When he went to don his armor, he felt it was slightly snug, but that was of no concern now. He would require new armor, new muggins and whatsits, and gubbins of power, now that he was so important, so it would be traded in time. Kronan strode forth and had his knobs beat a path through the adoring crowds as he went to the runt herds. And so it was that Kronan left his knobs at the base of the mountain and processed up, ever upwards, onto the trail to his sanctum. With him was a trail of grots, all tied one to the other in a line. A dozen were in his wake as he strode. Finally Kronan reached this, the highest point of the mountain, where there was a plateau from which the entire valley could be seen, and thus he walked unto his thinking spot. He assumed the position, cross-legged, sitting at the very edge of the ledge, surveying his realm. Kronan would do things differently this time. He knew that Kunnin did not entirely reside just in hats, but he donned the one he had taken from the leader of the Humis, in case his previous theorem still had any weight. But Kronan had even used Kunnin when planning how to arrange this period of contemplation, to find even greater Kunnin. For Kronan had measured his last attempt at thinking, and posited that it may have been the squealing of the grot, not just the crunching on them, that had been of most use to his Herculean cogitation. Thus, attempting to not just replicate, but to improve on the previous session, he had garnered a dozen thinking grots. As he tugged on the rope that confined them, they tried to drag backwards, but as none of them worked at the same time, some even tripping the ones closest to Kronan and then giggling insanely, the line moved forward quickly. Kronan grabbed the first grot, and with pragmatic swiftness, as it was merely a means to an end, he ripped the head off the first grot to prevent squealing too close to him, then pulled off its limbs and slowly began to munch. He could feel it. The Kunnin rising. The thinking grots, the thinking spot, the thinking hat. But he needed the one more thing. Kronan absently dragged on the rope, and one of the grots was then grabbed, untied, and tossed over the edge of the cliff. No. Kronan now sighed, as the squealing helped, but was not so loud as to be off-putting. As one finally finished, he would instinctively, and with no break in his majestic religious epiphany, unlatch and then lob another one over to just get the right ambience. And so, Kronan began to think. He had the Humi boxes, he knew. It had been his previous burst of Kunnin that had gained these precious lootable objects. Kronan was loath to ignore this previous glimpse of brilliance, but he had a concern. He had seen other boys dressed in the Humi's uniforms, and carrying their weapons. Yet Humies had somehow always discerned that it was a ruse. They had mystically known that they were not Humies. Perhaps the Humies gave off a smell or something. Or was it their hand gestures? Either way, Kronan was now not as certain that his plan would actually work. The idea was that they would use the Humie boxes to ride up to the gates of their local enclosure, and the Humies would open the doors as they always did. At that point, they could just charge inside and take the fort, a small city that had been there for generations untold of orcs. Now Kronan had been joined by a tribe with many snakebites, and they had squiggoths. Kronan had immediately ordered his own mech boys to plate them up with armor and see what ducker they could take. And in only a day or so they would be the walking fire platforms Kronan had always wanted. Not that he thought of it that way, or that precisely, but it was the truth nonetheless. And so Kronan thought more. It was not sustainable, he knew this. Not only were the flying thinking grots running out, he would have to bring more if he were to tread this path again, of course, but it was also astonishingly tiring. So he ploughed on in an attempt to solve the conundrum before his head literally exploded, as he had seen many odd boys had before. Nobody wanted that, after all. So, if the Humies did somehow find out that their boxes were not under their control anymore, what would they do? Kronan near fell off the ledge himself as he tossed over his last flying thinking grot. No, for it hit him. Like a thunderclap from the backside of Gork or Mork it hit him. He would have 2 plans. A plan within a plan. Hauling himself off his haunches and away from the precipice, so shattering had the revelation been that he could barely stand stably, Kronan lifted his fist to the air and laughed, the deep belly laugh of the Kunnin. For he would do both plans. The armoured column drove down the road that led directly to the gates of Aquilonia subsector 12, mining settlement 5. But not all were on the road. There seemed to be no uniformity of speed, and tanks and transports bumped into one another in mild collisions, almost jostling each other as they approached. The patrol had been expected back 7 days ago. The news had gone out to be on alert for any missing vehicles, or any survivors from the patrol. For surely they had been the prey of the filthy greenskins. How? Nobody knew. It was supposed to be a culling force after all. But it had finally happened. Hence when the ramshackle column approached, everyone at first was elated. There were cheers that went up from the wall as it hove into view. But the celebrant mood had soon evaporated at the state of the column arriving. Initially, as they got closer, it was looked upon with pity, as they moved as if all of the remaining occupants, drivers especially, had been shell-shocked, battered to the very edges of exhaustion. As the column became properly visible, it began to dawn on those officers on the gate guard that something was deeply amiss. The vehicles were not daubed with the usual paints and bits that the orcs did whenever they looted a vehicle, let alone this many, but something was definitely amiss. So as the column lumbered up to the gates and slowed down, they did not open. The lead vehicle came within spitting distance of the doors and then stopped. All behind it came to a stop after barging, jostling and bumping each other for over a minute. When the doors still did not open, the top hatch of the lead Lehman Russ opened. It wasn't the fact that the officer that popped out of the hatch seemed to flop to one side, nor that he seemed to have sticks holding up his arms when he waved. It wasn't that there was no hail or request to come inside immediately. It wasn't that he did not give his rank, formation and assignment. It was more the fact that when the officer bellowed, "Open the gates!" that he was still able to do so while his head had been sewn on backwards. The order was given with the simple lowering of an upheld hand, and the gate guard then unleashed every last weapon they had into the column. In moments, the weapons of the gate whirring into position and firing down. Melters, heavy bolters, and then covering the ground with flamers when the greenskins began to dive from the tanks and transports that were exploding around them. The gate guard began to whoop with a sense of victory too early, as they seemed to be exterminating the column and its new owners. It was not until too late they noticed the 3 huge armoured squigoths rumbling out of the tree line. Previously, they would have used the said firepower to wipe them out at long range, but they had not finished off the column and could not fire at both. The nearer danger had to be resolved, so they fired on the column. This gave the heavy weapons on the squigoths plenty of time to lumber into range and unleash their fire into the walls and parapets, hard points and fixtures of the gates and walls. Huge segments were annihilated in the first volleys. The darker that the mech boys had managed to array on them was truly staggering. Matters got worse for the defenders as the squigoths then took on a charge. Each ran at full pelt at the walls surrounding the gate, not the gate itself of course, as that had a wealth of debris in front of it that had previously been the tanks of the Astartes in guard. Their largest guns silenced, there was naught that the guard could do but concentrate all fire on one of the squigoths at a time in an attempt to bring them down. It worked once. The heavy bolters and remaining lance cannons on the walls tore it to pieces, and it dug a huge grove into the ground as it fell and lurched to its death, still skidding due to its momentum alone. But they could not take on another before they reached the walls and crashed through. Well, the second one did. The first one got shot in the eyes and did not so much plough through the wall, but into it and fall over. But the effect was the same. The walls in 2 huge rents were down. The horde of boys that were following the squigoths then rampaged through the breaches and into the city. It would not take long to subjugate the other humies. It was a good day. Kronan had lived up to his new name. He had been cunning indeed. As he charged through the breach, Conan looked around with relish. If he kept this up, his name would go down in legend. Of no importance to Kronan, of course, but it would mean that he would be party to some of the best fighting possible. He could just feel it in his newly empowered mind. He truly was doing the work of Gork and Mork, the work of the gods, just as the prophet had promised. There was definitely something to be said for this cunning thing. But now, it was time for the brutality, his favourite bit, as he charged into the settlement to crump humies. The kiss of dawn's first light saw the camp erupt into life. Grots ran to their nominal positions and posts, more like a thunderous charge than any orderly deployment. All had the warmth of a good day before them, for today was their first flying under their new colours, the banners of Kronan Da Kunnin. A boss of little repute up until recently, Kronan was unifying the tribes of Aquilonia the only way it could ever be done, with success, by action, with victory. Kronan Da Kunnin had exploded onto the scene of Aquilonia like a thunderbolt. It was said he was touched by the gods, that he was a disciple of the great prophet Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka himself, and he espoused something that had been in too little supply recently: cunning. So it was that Kronan had risen and all before him had fallen. Humies, any war boss or nob who'd challenged him, and even the Space Marines. And it was in this feat, this superlative display of not only brutality, which was, of course, the Orky way, but also of cunning, which was also the Orky way, or at least it should have been. Their mighty gods, the only ones that truly counted, of course, Gork and Mork, were the gods of brutal cunning and cunning brutality. Hence cunning was meant to be a way of life, a path set down by the gods themselves. Yet somehow it had always been the brutality that most emphasized up to this point. But now, finally, cunning had come to Aquilonia in the manifestation of this mighty war boss, Kronan. It was only weeks before that he had 3 other war bosses bend the knee, as the humans would say, to that mighty lord, and he took the increased forces under his command and went to work. For the first time ever, the greenskins of Aquilonia had tasted the heady intoxicant of victory over the mighty space marines. But more, he had taken a Humi city, then another, and another. And with each victory, more and more Ork tribes flocked to his banner. And with each new tribe, new forces, then new victories were garnered. Like a snowball that builds to an avalanche, the Orks were gathering impetus, momentum, power unto power, as was the Orky way, the way of the Wa. Their tribe was absorbed into the greater Wa, which, coincidentally, was exactly the same time as when the previous boss's head had rolled onto the floor of the audience chamber of Kronan Da Kunnin. It seemed Kronan had not been privy to the same worldview and manifest destiny as their war boss had, so the dissonance had been resolved the most expeditious way possible. In a fight. A fight that was marked only as being as brutal as it was swift. The head of Blood-Brow Bone Gnawer had bounced thrice before being smashed under the foot of that mighty and cunning war boss, Kronan, and all was accord once more. But now, Kronan had multiple squadrons of flyboys under his command, and, to the exultation and joy of his said squadrons, he intended to put them to immediate use. Thus it was that the grots sped around the wide landing field, their gurneys of missiles and bombs positively spilling over in their rush to get the vehicles ready for the flyboys' arrival. Of course, the stapling of many of the grots into some of the larger flyers had been a trial, but it had been done with efficient speed, for today was a day to remember. The runt herd's apoplectic bellowing had only just finished the preparations, when the huge doors of Dub Barracks slammed open, and the flyboys processed out. At their head, Daka von Smashhoven, the best flyboy for 100 years, easily led the flyboys in their charge towards their awaiting craft. Each battered any grots out of the way, then jumped into their flyers, slapping any grots inside their vessels for good measure. One always needs to let them know the hierarchical situation, of course. The grot support outside then grabbed onto propellers and cranked them. And off into the skies they leapt, like a very angry swarm of wasps. As the 100 or so flyboys flew over the armies of Kronan, they now went from horizon to horizon. All heard the bellows and hoots of approval from below, with only one of the flyers being knocked out of the skies by the encouraging shooter salutes. Thus did the flyboys of Daka von Smashhoven's own winds of war speed towards the enemy lines. They knew, and eagerly anticipated, the arrival of their Humi counterparts who had caused such trouble over the last few days. It was almost unfathomable to the winds of war why their previous boss had not permitted their being at least loaned to Kronan before, for they had been in the midst of a terrible lull in action, and it was known that if one does not take out one's weapon and use it on a regular basis, well, it would rust, wouldn't it? It was known. And the Humis did not disappoint. Out of the clouds above they came, hurtling down like hawks pouncing on prey. They cut down many a flyboy in their first pass, but were in for a very large shock when they came up to hide amidst the clouds once again. For Daka von Smashhoven had been in close parley with Kronan, and was deep in his counsel, whatever that meant. So it was that Kunnin had been gifted to von Smashhoven, like some funny disease, but a good one it seemed, for it had worked. For as the Humis in their thunderbolts climbed back up to be met by a wall of Daka, as Smashhoven and more than half of his flyboys dipped out of the clouds from above, and fell on them in turn, the previous wave of flyboys, giving chase from below, caused a perfect storm for the Humi plains, a storm of Daka. Daka to the left of them, Daka to the right of them. They got killed almost immediately. Von Smashhoven himself flew over the lines of Orks thrice to indicate their utter victory, before banking up to join his boys as they crisscrossed the skies above the Humi lines and killed with impunity. So confident were the Humis in their pilot's superiority that nary a single anti-aircraft vehicle or emplacement did they prepare, much to their lament. And thus did Kronan stride to the very front of his mighty army, his war, and bellow that one word to the heavens. With it, the entire horde moved as one, and charged the now shuddering and horrified Humi lines. Today was a good day to be an Ork, for with the cunning bit out of the way, the brutality ran like a river. Kronan and the Ways of Kunnin. Kronan Da Kunnin. His legend was begun, but it was a very short legend thus far, and so we reach a montage moment, covering a good few weeks and months, and a larger increase in his Ork power as more tribes flocked to his banner, but a brief one, because it's not the 80s. And so, Kronan began to walk the path of the Kunnin without fear. He welcomed ideas, and even came to trust some of them. One of his best ideas, the truest expression of Kunnin, was to learn from those around him. Thus it was that he took the boss of the Blood Axe tribe deep into his council, whatever that means, and by the fire they spoke of the ways of Kunnin. To move backwards was not always to run away. Sometimes the enemy would follow you into a trap. The ways of Kunnin seemed awfully like base knavery and utterly jelly-spined cowardice to Kronan, but the Blood Axe assured him it was actually Kunnin. And it seemed confusing at first. Kronan had to master his entire will, not to tear the head off the lesser boss, just to get him to shut up. But Kronan's will was iron, and the talking continued. It did so only because Kronan could feel it, the Kunnin rising. He was absorbing it, like the trees took in sunlight. Osmose thingy was his for Kunnin, or something like that, thought Kronan, as he began to comprehend. He now saw all of his mobs, clans, cultures, all of his forces as different things entirely, ingredients to a masterfully cooked banquet of battle, an orchestra through which he would play a symphony of savagery, a paean to the power of Gork and Mork. Or he would have done, if he were more verbose. But it was a good thing, no matter the phraseology, and he already knew the issues. The constant drain on his time, his joy, the ones who slowed him down. So some would have to go. Boss Rotbagger of the Death Skulls, whose nosing about on battlefields drained speed from their onward rush into Humi lands. Boss Redwheel of the Evil Sons, who kept heading off on excursions beyond where Kronan wanted the Humis to know they could reach. And of course, Boss Nostril Splitter of the Bad Moons, who had destabilized the natural loot dispersal matrices, causing force scarcity to inflate his market dominance, draining the war of its resources. Or, more simply put, Nostril Splitter was profiting mightily and slowing him down. Which is still not how Kronan would have put any of it, but a fact is a fact no matter how you dress it up. So the bosses were all called, their boys all arrayed as if for a battle, but it was to be a battle against their own natures, their own propensity toward ignoring cunning. It would be a celebration of cunning and should, just should, mind you, give birth to a veritable infusion of cunning across the entire blossoming war. Thinking grots by the thousands were being gathered, and a mighty mass cogitation was to transpire. The very first massed think. The very first thinkmas. And so the preparations for thinkmas continued, all throughout the night. 'Twas the night before thinkmas. Not a creature was stirring, not even a squig. The choppers were hung by the banners with care, in hopes that the boss would not come to them there. The grots all shuddered awake in their beds, with visions of thinking dancing in their heads. The runt-herds were excited and hardly slept, knowing their charges all silently wept. Out in the camp there arose a clatter, all hid in their nests, knowing what was the matter. Around the camp they stomped with a clash, rank designated by their vibrant sash. The moon on the armour and newly fallen did show, a lustre of midday on the Orkies below, when out of the dark the knobs did appear, a colossal bunch who elicited fear. With a mega knob marching mean and quick, I knew in a moment he had a big stick. More angry than mad boys onward they came, and he hectored and hit them and called them by name. Now smasher, now crasher, now killer, now masher, on slasher, on basher, on grinner and blitzer. To the top of the grot pens, collect them all, let none dash away, dash away, dash away all. So round the grot pens the knobs all flew, each dishing out wallops and kickings too. Then in a twinkle 'twas heard on the roof, the prancing and giggling of each little youth. As I drew in my head and was turning around, out of the crowd the mega knob did bound. He was dressed in power armour from head to his foot, and all was tarnished with blood and soot. The remains of a power claw he had on his back, none looked too close or he might attack. The hand of a Humi he had in his teeth, fumes of his anger encircled his head like a wreath. He was festooned with the heads of what seemed to be elf, and I peed myself a bit, in spite of myself. A wink in his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had everything to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to work. The knobs filled all their sacks with grots with a jerk, and laying his finger aside his nose and giving a spectacularly orky pose, he sprang to the catch wagons, to his knobs gave a whistle, and away they strode with a gargantuan bristle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy thinkmas to all, and to all a good fight." The bosses were all called, their boys all arrayed as if for battle. Whilst the entire camp exploded into activity and nervous excitement, few could see the genius, the hidden power to be released. For this was not an exercise in teaching or raising cunning, as Kronan had said. No, no, no. It was a celebration of his thinking, his cunning. Past tense. Because Kronan now knew how to beat the Humies. Oh yes, he did. He had to clean house before the bigger scraps. He had to unify the war once and for all. And his idea, it was cunning. So cunning, you could put a tail on it and call it a gyrinx. And so, all unarmed, well, mostly, and prepared for the celebration, the mighty war of orcs, a veritable sea of seething, sweaty and flatulent green skins, all sat as one, mob unto mob, tribe unto tribe. But all of the leaders, the various bosses, all sat up front with the big boss, Kronan Da Kunnin. Sat on a velvet blanket of Tyrian purple, the bosses sat silently adorned by their individually folded and personalized thinking grots. Only Kronan bore a hat, you see. There could be such a thing as too much cunning. And if any cunning were to be generated, then surely his hat would absorb and redirect it to the best receptacle. The cunning one himself, of course. Each thinking grot bore the mark of its corresponding boss on its cheeks, all four, the center of its forehead, on both feet and both hands. It seemed the branding runt-herds had been jobs worth, or just enjoyed the writhing and squealing of the grots under the white-hot irons. Difficult to tell which, mused Kronan, but a certain amount of zeal was probably attributable to this being the first thinkmas. And the bosses wanted to be dressed to impress, after all. As the still pungent whiff of scalded grot buttocks bellowed on the air, fighting for proboscis attention with the natural urinary odour exuded by the terrified grots, Every one of said grots gritted their teeth and remained silent, lest they be sent to the ranks of the soon-to-be burning, flying, thinking grots, those presently being loaded into a long rank of catapults. 'Twas a small mercy for some of the grots that they were given a red stick to bite down on to assuage the discomfort. This was, of course, only for some of the biggest bosses and their nobs. Some distinction had to be made for their luminous rank. However, it was felt that the nobs and Kronan himself did not require this distinction. Massive gongs were struck to signify the beginning of thinkmas. All fell silent and closed their eyes as they sat as one. The gentle serenade of 100 catapults ejecting the massed, burning, flying, thinking grots into the air, so all might gain from the ambience, as their parting chorus spake into the winds of the valley and echoed to all and sundry.
No, 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 no.
And it began. Thinkmas. Alas, it was an arduous, interminable period of unendurable tedium that many felt stretched into hundreds of seconds, until the inevitable started to happen. And heads, well, strangely, the heads of the nobs of bosses Rotbagger, Redwheel, and Nostril Splitter all exploded, their grot headgear and their own craniums all explosively bursting under the pressure of their attempts to think. And as the crowd gasped and giggled, then guffawed, it was decided by all that this was now a very funny and very enjoyable festival indeed. But none now wished to try thinking anymore. It was proven to be very hazardous to one's health, and should definitely be left in the hands of those more, well, adept at the craft. Let Kronan do all that stuff, they thought. Kronan looked to his palms and saw the second detonator. He had destroyed the nobs of his rivals, his annoyances, but the actual consideration to use it on the bosses themselves was anathema to him. Kronan stood and turned, lowering the device over his shoulder as he looked at the three bosses and bellowed. His nobs rushed into the remains of their nobs, who might have eaten or discarded their thinking grots, as Kronan himself charged boss Rotbagger. Although told to present unarmed, this meant that they only had a few weapons each. Kronan took one Herculean leap into the air and came thundering down on Rotbagger with all of his fury, and with all of his huge axe. The much smaller orc attempted to block the blow, but the force of the strike ended only when Rotbagger was cleft mostly in twain, peeling apart from the tops of his shoulders to the bottom of his hip. Kronan rounded on Redwheel, and the two met with savagery. Boss Redwheel was fast, pushing forward with his power claw striking in an overhead windmill set of attacks, Kunnin, and bawling its hatred at him. Kronan rolled underneath the third huge swing and behind Redwheel. As he span around to bring his power claw back into the fray, Kronan cut down hard and severed the boss's arm at the elbow. The claw landed with a thud at his feet. Redwheel cried out in anger and pain, but his mouth soon opened all the wider, when Kronan's axe came round and cut the top of his head off, just above the tongue. The orc fell backwards and ended with its tongue caressing the grasses out of the now highest point of its body. Kronan put it out of its misery with his boot. Thrice. Wiping his boots on the grass, Kronan looked for Boss Nose Splitter, but he was gone, disappeared into the mobs and sea of boys. The other bosses stood waiting to see if this was to be a full sweep, but were a bit relieved and also a bit disappointed when Daka von Smashhoven indicated for all to now sit down again. There was now glorious fighting across the entire war, but this was to be expected at a festival after all. And in the fighting, it was an almost universal coincidence that those younger and more enthusiastic followers of Kronan and his cunning came out on top. A new war was born on Thinkmas Day night. Tomorrow, they would be back on the move Tomorrow there may be less of them than before, but those that remained would be stronger, more brutal, and perhaps just a smidge more cunning than they were the day before thinkmas. Now, with that fun out of the way, Kronan began to plan his battle against the Humies, for it was to be on the plains, where Humies were mustering and maneuvering so blatantly as to be doing nothing other than giving a direct challenge. And Kronan would accept it. Kronan and the Way of Bubbles. Kronan stood and looked down on the field of combat. His field. For he was the biggest boss of the emergent war. None could now refute that. Mostly because he had split any recalcitrant hearts and souls in half, or torn their heads off, as he had done only recently at the massively popular thinkmas festivities. Without Boss Rodbagger to slow them down, or Boss Redwheel to tip off the Humies to the extent they had pushed, the war now moved with a speed, certainty and precision that would have astonished even Kronan but scant 5 months ago. Alas, Boss Nostril Splitter still eluded capture and detention. Well, for about 5 seconds before Kronan could get his axe to his neck, at the very least. A small annoyance, but one Kronan would not spend much time on. Nostril Splitter would turn up, or he would not. But no matter the situation, Kronan would be ready for him. But such sundry concerns would not be permitted to detract one iota of will and concentration from the Great One this day. For he could feel it. Not cunning this time, for that now suffused his every nerve, his every ganglia, his entire being. No, Kronan felt something else rising. Glee. Unabashed, unfettered glee. For it was one thing to fight the Humies around their cities, their great protective structures, but it was another entirely to enjoy the purity of an open field, something that had not happened on Aquilonia for as long as any of the greenskins could recall. Never before had there been orcs in such numbers, with such pride, with such gubbins and all the Penelope of war, or something like that, thought Kronan, as he looked across his mighty war. For he was in fine fettle, and knew his men were of over-burgeoning zeal for the scrap that was about to transpire. For days and weeks now, the humans had been maneuvering and deploying, so blatantly and so easily spotted as to be nothing as the most audacious of challenges to Kronan's might. A challenge that could simply not be ignored. Not least because to do so would be to severely curtail the emergent majesty and legend of Kronan, but more because it was a very polite way of the Humies displaying their respect for the Orks, and giving them such a welcome invitation to a party of prodigious and sumptuous proportions. The Imperium certainly knew how to put on a spread, thought Kronan. A pity that the main delicacy, the most superb of combatants, were not present, the Space Marines. The lines of Humies were predominantly made of little pink and brown and yellow Humies, all wearing their lovely uniforms. Rank upon rank of them, with armour and artillery aplenty. They had columns of Ogrin, Kronan was glad to see, but little else of real note. The human Imperial Guard, their anal militantum, were the only ones to take the field this day, it seemed. Yet Kronan Da Kunnin did not surrender to the potential disappointment and ennui that the lack of a real fight against Space Marines could have conjured within his troubled brow. He was, after all, quite a positive chap, and knew he should contend and content himself with the banquet Gork and Mork had laid before him. For he was an adherent of the great prophet of Gork and Mork, and in them he did trust. He knew that if he were to simply crush all that stood before him and his mighty war, that soon enough the real fighting would come to him. A day he looked forward to with relish. But now, to the events of the day. He need only crush these Humies in the most fun and devastating way possible, earning himself and his wonderful boys that Elysian field of a future war against the Marines, the Adipi arse-starters in High Gothic, or something like that. The Space Marines, that is all that matters. Kronan had toured his war for days now, knowing that each new morn brought more and more interesting and fun gubbins and darker and intriguing ways of waging war. He intended to use them all, for he knew exactly what he intended for his set piece. He would unleash his Goths, but he would soften up the enemy first by introducing them to the new darker and know-whats his mech boys had been cobbling together. The humans were in for a surprise or two. Oh yes, they were. And thus, as Kronan looked down on the plains, he laughed the deep belly laugh of the cunning. The leagues between the Ork War and the Imperium's Astra Militarum, its Imperial Guard, seemed all too short to the now disquieted army of humans. Things had seemed so certain when they had marched out in their orderly columns and formations, the grandeur of the human race preparing for war. All was organized, regimented, and orderly. Surely there could be no chance of defeat at the hands of the barbaric and imbecilic greenskins when so much of the Emperor's own power had been mustered in one place. In their ranks they had waited for days now, every morn presenting for the Orks to see their power, their might, their determination. It was felt that there would be no battle, that the Orks would take one look at the well-oiled military machine and skulk back into their forests and crags. But that was before they actually appeared in strength. When the Ork War crested the horizon, few of the men and women present were unaffected by the display. On they came, an unending tide of green. And it was only then that the spine of the guard began to slightly shift in discomfort. Those days were punctuated by a rigid and draconian enforcement of order by their officers. The commissariat wended their way through the massed ranks during the day and visited every campfire during the night. Always bluff and doughty, they heckled, hectored, and harangued where it would avail the best results, but would also take the time to encourage, to regale their compatriots with exploits and deeds against the greenskins, always highlighting the lack of import of numbers, and trying to stiffen the spines and raise the elan of the men and women in their charges. So it was that on the morn the guard went out to their arranged pickets and positions, their pre-measured and marked fire lines and ranges. But in all of the hubbub, their leadership had fallen into the most cunning of Kronan's traps thus far, for they had simply not concentrated. They had simply not fathomed or encompassed their doom. They planned the battle as they had done across the length and breadth of the Imperium since its inception, and they had underestimated Kronan and his cunning, and in this their downfall was assured. For they had forgotten a few key issues, things that they had always relied upon so much as to be considered as present as air, as certain as the bayonets on their weapons, dependable. But alas, this time they were not there, and the lack would be telling. The first few hours of light were the spectacle of a war waking up and then positioning. It was heralded by an ever-growing rumble. This was not just of the growling of the greenskins either, they were to find out. As high morning arrived, the war leapt into life and surged forward, and it was few that were present amongst the humies who did not take at least a slight step back at its advent. The first things to happen set the tempo of the entire engagement, set its course, and it soon dawned on the general in charge that he and his men were about to be dinner. As arranged, the event began with an onrush of vehicles, as the speed freaks moved like the horns of a bull towards the guard forces, the van following much slower at first. Expecting them to then charge into the ranks, or even front of their army, the guard were shocked to see them swerve off at the last moment, and careen around their flanks and then rear. A veritable deluge of fire was laid in front of them by the massed ranks of the guard heavy artillery. Recovering from their shock at the change in tack, the Humi officers did not concern themselves overly, as they knew their artillery would make burning carcasses of the Ork cavalry as it wheeled and spun around their rear. This was when their ears were rent by the thunder of Daka von Smashoven's winds of war. Falling on their formations from out of the clouds, the Ork air superiority was telling. Very. Blitzer bombers, burner bombers, and Waz bomb blaster jets rained explosive carnage down on the back ranks and the artillery of the hapless humans, and within minutes their guns were silenced. Confusion was heightened when the rumble of the very earth hit the lines. A wave of round balls with legs and teeth were loosed and surged towards the human ranks like an avalanche. They were simply inexhaustible, and without heavy box-barraged fire to cull and slow them, the squid charged with a tsunami of terror and teeth. With all of this going on, the humans could not witness the next stages as they were enacted. A mass of wagons had dragged a collection of huge Ork mech guns onto the flanks, but well within range, as the human lines disgorged their lasgun rounds at the oncoming wave of squigs. Thus they did not see the deluge of bubbles being released into the air above them. Like the plaything of a human child, the bubbles of brightly coloured force just floated through the air, up and then down onto the waiting humans. Many looked up and could not help but smile at this flash of beauty and serenity amidst the turbulent clangor of war. And they did until the bubbles landed. Some held out their hands to touch the first ones, like they were rare flakes of snow sent to bemuse and entrance. Alas, when the bubbles made contact, they would then explode in a wave of force of varying power. Some would slam the struck to the ground. Others would rupture with such force that they would launch anything they touched into the air, or for meters backwards into the milling army. As these detonations dotted the mid and back ranks of the army, more of the human force, more of their supporting heavy elements were rendered useless, as Lehman Russ and Hellhound tanks were flattened or spun into the air by the force, and then fell down onto more of their own men and resources. As the waiver squigs were amongst the men and women of the first picket lines, it became a massacre, for out of the dust and the screaming came the full force of the Goth clan. Kronan had harboured the power of his Goths, always using them for sledgehammer assaults on cities or locations that he had already enveloped within his war. So the armies of the Humies had, thus far, only really engaged speed freaks and some storm boys. They were utterly unprepared for the unfettered brutality of the Goth onward rush. And so it was that many a commissar leapt to the front of the lines in an attempt to stiffen the spines of his fellows by engaging and defeating an Ork leader, only to be smashed down and slaughtered by the sheer rage of the Goth assault. And without Space Marines, the only things who could stand a chance against the Goths, the most orky of all Orks, was the Ogrins. A huge line of which was hastily prepared as a breakwater, a dam behind which the human force could regroup and reorganize. But it was not to be. For the mech guns of the Ork War were still in range, and the lines of dense warriors were simply lifted into the air and thrown leagues through the atmosphere by the tractor beams of the Ork mech guns. A situation that would lead to more than one mech boy being physically castigated by a surly Goth later on. But the instant effect was the rout of the Ogrins, as they felt the Emperor himself was making them fly out of the way of the Orks and punishing them. In a childlike way, they grasped that the Emperor was certainly not with them this day, and fled. And the rest was simple. Brutal, fun, and final. Did I mention brutal? Good, because it was. As the last light of day dipped below the horizon, the sizzling of many a rattling foot and frame caressed the nostrils of all throughout the camp. Kronan was heralded as the best boss that had ever trod the ground of Aquilonia. For through his cunning and brutality, an army of some 40,000 humans had not only been bested, but trounced. The casualties of the Orks were considered less than a trifle, piffling. And so Kronan went to his bed of rest with the glow of Gork and Mork in his breast. He had done it. He had shown the Greenskins that they could be powerful, that they could even beat the Humies in massed engagements, and this would be the last clarion call necessary to unify those larger mobs and tribes that had refused his manifest destiny up to this point. Soon they, too, would also be clamouring to join his war. And Kronan knew nothing on Aquilonia would ever be the same again. Kronan and the Riddle of the Cans. And so it was that only a cycle ago the Humies had been defeated in open battle. A vast array of them had mustered on the plains and marched out to meet Orks in stoic and stolid ranks and columns, glittering pennons shining in the morning light. But Kronan was the cunning one, the follower of Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of Gork and Mork. And through brutal cunning, or was it cunning brutality? Nobody was quite sure on that one. Either way, Kronan had trounced them. His mighty war could not be stopped. It was a seminal moment, a breakthrough of staggering proportions. It was the dream of every Orkoid on Aquilonia to be part of a proper war. And now, for the first time in living memory and longer, it had happened. Kronan had arisen, and all had fallen before him. Well, almost all, for as he rose, there must have been something in the air. For all of the Orks of Aquilonia began to coalesce into larger and larger war bands. Most marched to join the war, but as with any family, there was always one. From the previously quiet northern reaches, there also arose a war boss of a caliber not seen before. Lord Tooth Smasher of the Evil Sons tribe was reported to be sweeping all before him as he journeyed south. His speed war was touted to be nearing the size of Kronan's cunning war. A confrontation was looming as Kronan moved his war to meet them. Both sides sacking every Humie settlement and city in their path. The two sides were drunk on the rarest of Aquilonian drafts. Victory. And it would be a titanic battle when they met. But with all of this going on in the macrocosm of the Aquilonian body politique, there were dark rumblings across the fringes of Orc society. For something was amiss, something that began to trouble Kronan more and more as the days and weeks ploughed on. It was beginning to become increasingly difficult to gain good thinking grots. Kronan had not noticed it immediately, nor had he been concerned, but things were getting out of hand now. When going for a session of contemplation, of thinking, Kronan now found that his knobs were gone for much longer, and so he gathered the runt herds for an explanation. Kronan sat atop his new and imposing chair, a thong someone had called it, or something like that. And thus it was that Kronan looked down on all from his thong, as the camp bristled and waves of shouting and general ruckus went off in ever-decreasing ranges as the runt herds were corralled toward him. With mega knobs fanned out in two horns behind him, the standard knobs beat and bustled them into a huge milling crowd before Kronan's thong. It soon became apparent that asking questions of such a large group would grate on Kronan's nerves, as all began to shout their individual responses, excuses, concerns, and observations. After a mild cull, very enthusiastically performed by said knobs, order began to develop. Kronan would ask a question and leave them for a full day to chat it out and give one answer. And so, the next 2 weeks went by and the answers were collated each day. And each new morn there were less runt herds, as it seemed that the genesis of the lack of grots was indeed a very hotly contended point. Kronan was proud that his runt herds display as much love of orkiness as he in their deliberations. But a picture began to form, and Kronan was shocked to his very core. For the grots had experienced what some might call the perfect storm. The factors were clear, and the cause apparent. Much of it was his fault. The issues had gained speed as the war had grown, for so many of the new bands of orcs that had joined in the last cycle had not been at thinkmas. Thus they did not really believe the other orcs when it was stated that their heads could explode if they attempted what had previously only been performed by Kronan, the use of cunning, which all knew could only be done at the expense of that most horrid of pastimes, most feared of dark arts, that of thinking. And so many of the more get-up-and-go, more aspirational war bosses under Kronan had deemed that if he was big boss due to his cunning, then the only way to ever compete would be to engage in this process too. So it was that many a standard grot had been repurposed as a thinking grot. Some were then elevated to flying thinking grots, or even the most premium of all of their kind, thus far developed, the burning flying thinking grot. Not that it availed them anything of note, for none could harness the power of Kunnin as had Kronan. Of course, Kronan knew why. This was due to their lack of appropriate receptacles for the Kunnin energies to suffuse their bodies. They lacked hats. No matter the results of their use or lack thereof, it was an irrefutable truth that this had diminished the number of grots. On the other side of matters, those mobs that had been present at thinkmas had witnessed the dangers in thinking. The popping of so many knob heads had been all the lesson many needed, and it turned out that a small but growing number of his war had started to push grots away from them, and were intensely brutal, as they should be, for this is the Orky thing to be, of course, in these warnings. Many sections of the camp had circles of dead grots around their perimeter, usually just before a sign stating, "No think zone." It seemed that the dangers of thinking had been taken on board. More than this, many orcs had decided that the close proximity of grots might elicit spontaneous and uncontrollable instances of thinking, and thus no think zones dotted the camp. When one or more of the dead grots' encirclement got a bit pongy, they would be replaced forthwith. Hence, the massacre of the grots continued. The next issue had been the newfound hobby raging through the runt herds and others, that of Orkigami. Again, taking a leaf out of the war boss's own book. Not that anyone would have put it that way, because they did not know what a book was, nor would they be able to use it if they did. Well, apart from as toilet paper, of course. But then, orcs are not especially known for their hygiene, so the concept of wiping, let alone having something soft to do so with, was lost on them. So a book would have literally no use to except as a subpar projectile or a subpar repast. But I digress. Back to Orkigami. The art of folding grots, as pioneered by Kronan himself, had become an overnight success. It began with the construction of thinking grots for the thinkmas festivals, the runt herds all taking a class from Kronan himself on the suitability of the grot to be used, the ways in which the most secure folding should be done to retain the structure, the very art that they had produced. Many trends had already come and gone, only to be replaced by the newest hotness. The hands up the butt trend was surpassed by the 2 hands and a foot up the butt, which had fallen before the allure of the both hands and feet up the butt position, which had been practically risible in the face of the full circle fold, which was surprisingly difficult to get right without the grot splitting, which of course was seen as utterly incompetent on the behalf of the runt herd performing. But the full circle fold, which was particularly noted for both hands and feet and head being folded into the butt of the grot, was then replaced by the natural progression to multiple grots being used in the one display. Some preferred to finish their works with a coating of liquid metal, but found that this somehow changed the shape of the Orkigami. Others prefer their work to be temporary, accepting the march of the ages and its importance and permitting theirs to deteriorate over time as Gork and Mork intended. Otherwise, why would grots rot at all, if it was not their will? But in any case, the fad had used up a great deal of the grots in the war. As a side note, the art of Orkigami never really took on. Alas, the runt herds were usually beaten to a pulp if they attempted this natural progression from Orkigami to Orkigami, as most boys were sufficiently sizable to thrash a runt herd easily. Some bosses had indulged for a period in Orkigami, but it just simply was not as satisfying as Orkigami, and it was time-consuming. Many a boss decided that if the runt herds had time for Orkigami, then they surely were not being orky enough, and many clans roundly thrashed them as a result. But runt herds were an ancient and honoured group, for as weak and pathetic as the grots were, it was a rare orky camp that could not exist for long, or be as strong as a tribe without a surfeit of them. Odd, Kronan had to admit, but it was one of those things. Inscrutable, ephemeral, the need for grots. Again, as Kronan was indeed the very first orc to perform Orkigami, it was hard to not see this as somehow his fault. Then there was the last issue, The one which probably had the most impact, if Kronan was willing to admit. That of his enemy, his rival, the only Ork to even consider challenging him now. Tooth Smasher and his Speed War. Kronan had been utterly unaware that the Speed War had sent forth strike mobs. How could he know? None of said mobs had gone within spitting distance of his own war. But he now encompassed the gravity of the situation. For looking back, he did recall many an Ork stronghold that they had found recently, denuded of any fighting Orks, only having squigs wandering aimlessly. He now recalled the odd presence of so many piles of dead grots. Not even grot bones. They had not even been consumed, which struck Kronan even then as a bit of an oddity unto itself. But they were only grots, so he had not thought about it. Because thinking was not easy, and certainly not without its inherent dangers. It could not be done on a whim. Looking back, the lines of grots on spikes that strung out across the continent as they went further north, he had thought the work of the Humies. They bothered with this sort of thing. Orks did not, or so he had thought. Thus did Kronan replay the many sights he had previously dismissed as not worthy of recalling. The pits of them, the miles of them and stakes, mostly dead. Some fidgeted, of course, but that was to be expected if you had a spike stuck up your butt, Kronan mused. And realization dawned. So, Tooth Smasher had been targeting grots, had been exterminating them on purpose. He wished to prevent Kronan from his mighty cogitations, the very root of his cunning. Now all knew that grots were swift in their production. They were almost as plentiful as squigs, taking only days before a crop would blossom and then scratch and crawl their way out of the ground. But as they were now being used for so many things, prized in a way they had never been prized before, the demand clearly exceeded even the prodigious proliferation of the grots. There were some rumours of one other possibility, but all knew this impossible, and the laughter it elicited prevented the runt herds from responding for 3 consecutive days. So filled with the mirth of it were they. But it was not funny to Kronan. Not one bit. For a reason none but he could fathom. For the runt herds stated that there had been reports of grots gathering in their own collectives, hiding away from the larger kin, the Orks, and trying to make a go of it on their own. This even made Kronan chortle initially. Or it did, until they revealed the horror. For the runt herd stated that they had spotted some of these little vermin wearing long grey coats like the Humies. Strange and un-Orky, but that was grots for you. It was when one of the Orks reported that he had seen the self-same grey-clad grots wearing Humie hats that Kronan sat up and stared. Hats. The grots had discovered the wellspring of cunning. Kronan laughed no longer. And thus it was that Kronan received an embassage. For in his hour of need, the unthinkable had indeed occurred. For beyond the skies, beyond the confines of Aquilonia itself, a visitor had come. And not any visitor, but Zogrod Wartsnaga himself. Now it was not obvious to Kronan or any of his war who this person was initially. How could it be? Only Humies had ships that would defeat the pull of the land. Even the bestest of Darker von Smashoven's winds of war could not manage to go so high as to be able to get into the cold blackness above the planet. Well, not and live, anyways. So the delegation had to take its time in explaining the importance and history of the famous Ork. He was a grot trader, the best in all of the universe, they said. But more than this, he had an immediate solution for Kronan in the form of hundreds of thousands of his trained grots. But with said trained storm grots, he also had a plethora of spares. Grots like a river, the embassage stated. And all looked on in dumbfound silence. The shock of it. Could there really be a visitor from the other worlds of Orkidom? Was he a herald of the great prophet? What on Aquilonia was a plethora, and was it contagious? But the long and short of it was that the embassage, made up entirely of grots as a sign of the power of this legendary Zogrod over them, wanted to arrange a meeting. And so, the moot was to be held in the one place that was the most sacred to the cunning war in all of Aquilonia. It would happen on the spot it all began. Kronan's very own Axis Mundi, his sanctum sanctorum, his thinking spot. Thus did Kronan come to the meeting alone, as suggested, with only Tiddles in tow. Tiddles in high Gothic. He changed the name of his squig when he decapitated the prize felinoid pet of the governor of Zamantha Principality, because it was a lovely bit of muggins, shiny, big, bejeweled, the name tag. And thus Nutcruncher gave way to Tiddles, Tiddles the Terror, for he was about 6 foot tall, and had seemed to keep pace with Kronan as he developed. Speaking of which, Kronan had bulked up recently, and could simply not fit into his armour any longer. Again. The armour that had been stretched, reforged and augmented thrice over the last cycle. His size was now prodigious in the extreme, even for a boss. And thus brand new armour was in the process of being constructed, with all of the best muggins, gubbins and know-whats anyone could wish for. Kronan himself held back one piece of know-whats, but we shall discuss that later. So Kronan stood with Tiddles in his most natural state. For if one is to have no shiny armour, then one may as well look the part by showing off one's best traits, the unfettered visage of his powerful form, and the many, many scars that displayed his experience and accomplishment in combat. The quiet of the place was then shattered. No long procession of grots appeared. No flags and banners and pennants and skull sticks to herald the power and import of the visitor. No. The sound of a score of stomping feet and whirring bits and pieces clashing together, all marching up to his sacred thinking spot, was all that met Kronan's ears. He looked down to the approach, and there they were. A line of killer cans trailed up towards him. Kronan did not bat an eyelid until the last little body hove into view, and he knew immediately he had been betrayed. There was no visitor from the skies, from the cold void in greater Orkigami, for the diminutive figure at the end of the line of killer cans was a grot, and grot in a long grey coat, and he had a hat on. The grots had indeed risen, and Kronan had the sinking feeling he had been outfoxed and outthought by the wretch. Kronan hefted his axe onto his shoulder, drew out his best shooter, a specifically nice one, and looked down at the small stalk barely poking out of the ground at his feet. Kronan may have been outfoxed, but since his revelation and acceptance of Kunnin, he was never, ever unprepared. The killer cans, with their tiny grot drivers encased within, marched up toward the solitary figure. Kronan stood proudly in the buff, brandishing his mighty chopper, which the Humi subcategorized as an axe, because they were boring, and had little to do but endlessly name things that needed no real delineation. In his left hand was his best shooter with underslung rocket launcher. At his side was his trusty attack squig Tiddles. Kronan considered talking to Gork and Mork to beseech them for victory against insurmountable odds. You know, praying. But on hindsight, he deemed that neither Gork nor Mork cared for such things. They would not remember who fought who, or why, only that few stood against many. But then he also realized he did not have the tongue for it. Nor did he actually want their help. That sounded a bit needy to him. Certainly the least orky of all attributes. And thus he ceased his musings as the first of the killer cans opened up on his position. Big shooter and rocket fire thudded up at him like a storm, the air thick with doom. But as stated, Kronan was actually prepared. He knew every single rock, every ledge, and every blade of grass on the approach, and at its summit. This was his thinking spot after all. So as the killer cans marched upwards, they found that this boss was as swift as ever he was cunning. Plus, of course, he cheated. Kronan bounded from ledge to ledge, avoiding concentrated waves of fire, all the while firing down his own underslung rockets. One after another of the killer cans went off the side of the approach, were thrown off by the impact of his shots, or, even worse for them, Kronan was using the environment as a weapon and forced rock slides from above so they would be swept off in small groups. And to the frustration of the killer cans, some of them could have sworn that they got direct hits on his unarmored torso. Yet he always appeared out of the smoke and debris unharmed. For this, the answer again was his cunning. For Kronan had found he could not avoid the ideas that forced themselves into his head no matter what he now did. Of course, none could teach Kronan anything about the art of origami, he being its midwife. But while indulging in his one and only foray into Orkigami, it struck Kronan how much could actually be packed into this seemingly redundant area of the body that was only hitherto used for the expulsion of digested matter. A strange observation he had discarded until the arrangements for the meeting had been received. Standing proudly without his armor, or anything else, to prove he was practically unarmed, well, practically, Kronan knew he could not hide his secret weapon, and thus he had hidden it in the only place permissible, but luckily amply provided for the requirement. But what was it? Now, when Kronan had slain the bosses at the thinkmas event, he had left their bodies and gubbins alone, but his aides in the mechanics had not been so restrained. Nor had they been able to restrain themselves from taking a shufti around the derelict camp of Nostril Splitter of the Bad Moons, who had escaped the slaughter, but had to leave his muggins behind. And one of them had found the item that had been the reason for the success of said boss. A field generator. Small and seemingly dainty, Kronan had been concerned that an excessive clench of his mighty buttocks may shatter the thing entirely. Yet he knew that to go to the meeting without any protection at all would be rather daft, and thus he keisted it. And it was a good thing he had, for with each killer can that he neutralized, the firepower reduced. But it was like standing in a storm at its start, or when the killer cans eventually made their way into closer ranges and unloaded their grotzookas at him. Concerned that proximity may be an issue, Kronan was forced to turn to make sure that trinket was the closest thing to the oncoming fire. Hence, whenever he knew that some shot would strike, when he wasn't fast enough, he turned and made sure the field generator was in situ by mooning at the oncoming fire. Which worked. It could not hold out forever, but it did not need to. With less than half of the initial force reaching the plateau, the next phase of the conflict was considerably less strenuous than Kronan would later relate to his boys. For he was able to destroy more of the cans at range, as he shot them with precision, but many shots went into each can, despite his skill and accuracy. Close quarters was now unavoidable, as well as being by far the most enjoyable part of any good scrap. Kronan maintained his swiftness, and the cans lurched after him around the clearing, two with burners being particularly annoying, as he could not afford to stop to kill them or be burnt to a crisp. Kronan thus charged around, rolling under the huge buzzing and whirring blades of the cans like some intensely lethal assault course. But with each roll and jump, its conclusion was a lethal flurry of attacks from his massive chopper. But he would only barely tear one to pieces before he had to continue his scramble around the thinking spot. All the while the small got dressed in his grey overcoat and peaked hat shrieked directions at the killer cans. Kronan made for him whenever there was a gap in the lines, but they closed it immediately and forced him back again. Kronan would normally have seen that they may well have done better against him if they had not been keeping an eye on this oh-so-precious leader Grot. But at the present he was simply enjoying himself far too much to taint the experience with thinking. The killer cans were screaming and running at Kronan, who now circled the clearing, and they fell in behind him like a conga line, forever just 2 paces behind. Up to this point, Kronan's pet attack squig, Tiddles, had decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and hide nor hair of him had been seen for some time. Tiddles then declared his presence, and his considerable loyalty to his master, by diving out of a small huddle in the rocks. With only 3 strides and a last pounce, Tiddles enveloped the leader Grot in his mighty jaws, and snaffled the whole lot in one gulp. With this, the cans all stopped, and watched the spectacle in despair. And in that instant, Kronan struck. He skidded to the small stalk that barely broke the surface of the soil, Luckily, he had always avoided this particular region of the thinking spot, so none of the cans had crushed that below, for Kronan now dug down into the ground like a corgi on PCP, but it was just fast enough. As the killer cans awoke from their shock and wailing and chased after Tiddles, Kronan excavated his second secret weapon, pulling the straw out of the mouth of the wide-eyed, emaciated and gibbering weird boy. Kronan did not hesitate even an instant, and pulled out the orc and lifted him up, draping his torso and legs in the crook of his right arm, pulling its neck hard with the left and pointing its head at the cans, stretching its neck out and cocking it. Kronan bellowed as all of the force of the Wa within him seemed to flow into the weird boy. He pointed the weird boy at the cans, and a wave of green energy cascaded from it into them. The cans were suffused with green energies as they were picked up and thrown from the cliff top. Chortling hard, Kronan threw the weird boy over his shoulder and accepted the bounding Tiddles into his arms. What a glorious day. But then, it happened. As always. His joy was interrupted by his mind again. For Kronan knew there could only be one way this had all happened. His adversaries knew too much. There was a squealer. But who was it? A riddle, to be sure. Madnut Krunkelstein, his very own chief weird boy, whose psychic feet stomps were larger than any other. Git Squisher McMurder, the mostly cyber-orc war boss. Dakar von Smashhoven. Surely not. His winds of war kept him far too busy, and far too happy. The returned nostril splitter, perhaps. Or Grinner the Backstabber. No idea how he got that strange name. I mean, who stabs anyone anywhere but the face or the body? But they were like that. A strange bunch were the freebooters. A conundrum, to be sure, but one that Kronan had to crack. His life and his war now depended on it. That was then. This is now. The riddle had to be solved. Kronan reclined on his massive golden chair, his thong, or something like that, in a rare moment of unadulterated glee. A quiet moment, just for himself. As he basked in his newfound trove of knowledge, a thing he would previously have avoided like the rot. He had taken some of the logs and picked capture devices from the latest conurbations and settlements he had smashed on his way north. Humie stuff. He was especially interested in the scorecard, as he came to know it, or the menu, for it listed and gave histories and formations of all of the forces now on Aquilonia. Of course, he knew of all of these by now, but also across the sector and beyond. A dazzling myriad, and what a treasure trove it was. White-haired, slim, short Marines, with pointy noses and Eldar-like features, yet still in power armor, still Marines, surely. The regiments, or flavors, as Kronan liked to call them, of Imperial Guard, the anal mini-tantrum, or something like that. The metallic ones, with mech boys as actual bosses. Humans were so weird. And, of course, the Space Marines, the Adipi Arstarters. He longed for them to come back in force. He had even espied a new life goal. For the Marines came in different flavors as well. They had cultures and tribes and everything. Kronan had always suspected that they had more Ork in them than Humie. But now he basked in a newfound thought, goal, dream, raison d'etre. It was not just to spread the word of the gods, to be their vessel of cunning. They had shown him the way. Or at least he had hoped they had. Because if it came down to a choice between their good works and this succulent opportunity, Kronan was not sure his faith could hold. Because he had discovered that they were not just Nob Marines, better, bigger, harder ones. The Prim Anus Marines, or something like that. There were also black-clad ones that claimed to slay Orks. Death Watch. He liked the idea of fighting them. But his jaw had dropped, and he had seen the light, in this last and most precious of entries on his vista of Crumpin. for these ones wore the shiniest armour. They wielded huge spears with bolters on them. They were gold collector edition space marines, called Odors, or something like that. But despite their silly name, these were definitely the ones he wanted most. They were the best, and did he not deserve the best? But he knew he would have to earn it, would have to work his way through all of the other colours and flavours, before they even let him near the gold ones. And it inflamed an already roaring fire of ambition. His war was not just spiritual, not just a work of the gods. It was now a journey of personal discovery and accomplishment, betterment and improvement. He would be the Ork that collected the gold ones, the Odors. Oh, yes, he would. So much variety, he had never dared hope that such could exist. Well, he would have said that, if he had ever previously hoped, or ever really thrown his perspective into anything more than the next 5 minutes back then. The early couple of years, when life was simpler, and he was not yet infected with destiny, caught in the snare of the prophet, had not begun on the path the gods had placed before him. Then, he did not know the dark and terrible ways of Kunnin. Nor was he so blasted by the ravages of thinking, and the mental scarring that led to the near-constant danger of ideas. Yet this was one element of the ways of Kunnin that he did not mind. The anticipation could be vexing. He would certainly not have endured it before. But he had grown. He was no youth taking the teeth from his first kill, or any passing grot or snot. He was a big boss of Orks now. Not one tribe, not one clan, but a vast and populous people. He had a duty now. To those people. To their needs. But luckily, their needs were in great harmony with his own. For was he not the most orky Ork there? Yet still an Ork. He understood his people. They had 3 main aims, all requiring to be met in abundance for the war to stay alive. The first, they would need fighting. The second, they would need food that was not grots. But we'll get onto that in a moment, don't let me forget. And 3, they would need more fighting. There would also be a need for gubbins and muggins. Whatsits too. Kronan knew all too well these days. But these were luxuries. Could be done without at a pinch, if the main 3 needs were met. For the controversy had its roots in the recent past, and the controversy over the consumption of grots had become something of an oddity unto itself. The craze of Orkigami, as discussed at length previously, and no think zone boundaries, and the war of attrition waged by his only remaining rival, Tooth Smasher, and his minor speed war, all had added up to denude his army, his war of their grots. He never mentioned the last issue, even while alone in the dark. The grots had rebelled, and some even wore hats. Not normal hats, mind you, for many an Ork could be seen in headgear. Helmets, hats, fezzes at times even. And the freebooters were renowned for their spacious and aggressively marked head-covering accoutrements. No. These little wretches were wearing premium Humi knockoffs, if not the real thing. And Kronan had long ago divined that the reason for the Humi's prodigious powers of deduction were inextricably linked to their sumptuous and obviously idea-attracting hats. But on the other hand, Tiddles had consumed what he presumed was their leader. The leader of the Grot Rebellion. So perhaps it would just die off. If Kronan was to take his rightful place as a big boss of all of Aquilonia, then he would need to defeat his rival, and then the Humis first, as they were actual threats to him. But he knew deep down that on the day that he had the head of the leader of the Humis on a pike, he would then task his boys with the systematic hunting down and slaughtering of every last one of the so-called Grot Rebellion. But quite literally, he had bigger fish to fry today, and there were few bigger fish than the catch of the day. In his last mighty cogitation, he decided 3 things, as 3 was most definitely now Kronan's favourite number. It was elegant and efficient, the number 3. It showed he could indeed count beyond 2, could conceptualize the worth and quantity of an abstract such as a number. Yet he rarely went beyond that point. He could, but it all seemed too much effort. This was especially true of the battles. He knew of the relative strength of the forces he had, what he would send them at, why, and in what numbers. He understood numbers now, and that terrified all around him. But in reality, in day-to-day use, conversationally like, 2 orcs shooting the breeze while sharpening choppers ready for the next day's crumping, Kronan found that 3 was sufficient. The need to counter 4 was seen as an extravagant use of energy, when the same point could be made just as well by punching anyone he wanted to intimidate that much. Risk to reward. His time was now a finite thing, and Kronan knew his energies, though divinely inspired and exceeding any on the world for vim and vigour. Even his were not limitless. As such, he instilled his own rule of 3. It worked wonders. An instant success from day 1. And it was so simple. Kronan was astonished he had not had the idea before. But then, the origin of ideas was a thing even his subtle and flexible mind could not, or more to the point would not, consider. In any case, the rule was as thus. To bring back balance to his forces, he let it be known high and low that each third meeting would end in a crumping. All instantly knew what this meant, and what it heralded. Kronan was going to lay into the participants of every third meeting. But it was pure genius. For none knew what a meeting was, and it was defined by his knobs, who had been instructed to disseminate this new rule to the entire war, as being, "The boss says it's talking." Hence all now only came to see the big boss Kronan, if they had simply no other choice, no alternative avenue for a course. But it was very open to his interpretation, of course, as Kronan could define a meeting as a conversation, or each individual line someone said, depending on his boredom or aggression thresholds that day. Of course, a flexible system was only correct for such a unique and rare phenomenon as the cunning one. And in no time at all, the boss botherers, toadies and weird boys all gave him a very wide berth. Yet if Kronan were to speak to someone, or more often summoned them to his presence, then rules were usually off. He could be quite affable, as long as he was the initiator of any discourse, and it lasted exactly as long as he wished. He had blessed silence more now than he had since his first victory over the Humies those long moons ago. But he also had been raising his fightiness, getting into shape, the best shape he had ever been in. And the constant combat was assisting the augmentation of his already hulking frame. Kronan now seemed to grow by the day, only little by little, but never ending. He was becoming. He still had the rival war to finish, and then the Humies. He would need every last millimetre of height, every ounce of muscle mass. This was going to be fun. But back to the riddle. Someone in his camp had been informing his enemies of his movements, his plans, his dreams, his strengths and weaknesses. Not that Kronan thought he had any, of course, because that would be self-doubt, a thoroughly un-orky thing, and certainly not for the most orky Kronan. But how could he flush out the rat, the snake in the grass, not to be mistaken for the snakebites, who did indeed usually like the grasslands, but it wasn't them. Kronan was pretty certain of this, as they had been one of the first 3 tribes to join his war, and, besides, it was known that Tooth Smasher's speed war had zero respect for the antiquated snakebites, unlike Kronan, of course, who could see their relative merits in his force. The squiggles alone were enough reason to be honest. Wonderful beasts that they were. Now Kronan did consider securing the services of Grond, Chains Grond, the freebooter specialist who seemed to be eminently experienced for this sort of cloak and dagger stuff. Now that's Chains Grond, debonair orc of mystery, not to be mistaken for the infamous Yanes Blonde, admiral of an Eldar corsair fleet that plied the local stars, nor Blaine's Frond, the ferocious sentient psychopherne of Ramadala Ding Dong 4. But Kronan was loath to engage his services, as he was reported to be talker. Perhaps in the future, if Kronan's own attempts to beat the bushes did not make the squealer reveal himself. I asked you not to let me forget, but you did. For this brings us back to grots. For Kronan to master this conundrum, he would indeed need a mighty cogitation, a bout of uninterrupted and terrifying thinking. He would need all of his cunning if he was to disentangle himself from the riddle in which he found himself snared. The identity of the squealer. The riddle of squeal. Now Two Smasher, his rival, had been reaving across the north and central plains of Aquilonia. His remit seemed to be recruiting as many mobs as possible, but also to slay as many grots as he could, to denude the world of the most fundamental element of Kronan's mystic process, the use of thinking grots. No grots, no thinking. Perhaps Two Smasher had some small smattering of the touch of the gods himself, as this could very well be construed as nothing but cunning. But Kronan knew that this upstart tryhard did not know the ways of cunning, for Kronan was pretty much certain that Two Smasher would have forgotten the most important part, the hat. And thus it was, the lack of grots had been a real issue, and Kronan had to react with some of the most un-orky rules he had ever heard. Rule the first, no eating grots, unless there were no squigs left that day. Rule the second, no think zones were to be marked by the skulls of humies, who undeniably did the most thinking, instead of lines of decomposing grots. Now these diktats did not go down well initially, or later on actually, but there was little real kerfuffle later, due to Kronan's way of enforcing his edicts. These great rulings were declared to be a stopgap action, and never intended to be permanent, of course, and that Kronan would release these strictures at the cessation of the battles on Aquilonia. In fact, even earlier than that. Kronan let it be known he would revoke these emergency rules as soon as he had crumped Two Smasher and the Speed War was absorbed into the only real Orky force, the Cunning War. But Kronan had been ready for said potential kerfuffle, for he sent out his mighty guard, his knobs and mega-knobs. He had not gathered them all in one place for a long moon now, so he was actually quite surprised at how much they had grown. Not only in size, of course, for they seemed to be almost matching Kronan's own consistent growth. They now towered over the knobs of other bosses, but also in number. Kronan had fleeting recollections of the many times he had been asked by this or that mega-knob if this one or that one could be given a place in his guard. When he saw the mega armor and sizes, the trophies, he would always just nod. Unless there were two candidates, of course, in which case he would have them fight for the place, using the teeth of the loser to buy muggins to befit the new station. The loser's head to be added to the pile, of course. But in all this, he had never viewed them all in one place, and the memories flashed back like a bad horror movie when he saw them all assembled. Ranks of them, columns. He had never dreamed that there were so many orcs of such size, such armor, such power. They had proliferated at such a rate. He called it a rash, like an ever-expanding legion. Thus he saw his knobs and mega-knobs all there, all wearing the black of cunning. Well, he gave them their fighting name. They would be his Black Legion. Now the name was not really popular at first, but it had a twang to it that made it feel like it could be built on, so all howled in approbation. Thus did Kronan order his greatest warriors, his most brutal thugs in the war, to enforce the new rules. Alas, it was this same day that Kronan's bodyguard gained another name, for it was the Bloodaxe that they moved on first, and they did not like the new rules, so an example was made. Many of the Bloodaxe did not bend the knee easily, but when the slay stack grew apace, the Black Legion destroyed any who resisted. Two things happened. The Bloodaxes did eventually acquiesce, but they coined a new sobriquet for the enforcers that swept the camp and never was able to be shifted after that. For it was a typical Bloodaxe naming convention. They called them Kronans, of course, as they were his, but then they abbreviated Kunnin, and added the obligatory TZ that makes all things sound more orky. Alas, the The combination is not for the ears of youths or wee grots and squiglings. So just know that the name permeated the entire congregation of the War, and did quite a lot to get the point across, as to the depths Kronan's enforcers would steep in order to enforce their boss's will. And in a matter of only a few weeks, the camp was overrun again with the little wretches. Which led on to another issue. For after a month of this, the wee grots were in such a surfeit that it was not just a metaphor that they overran the camp. Hence it was that the mass cogitations were again considered, as this would surely use up many a grot.
No.
But this has not proven a popular idea with either of the no-think zoners, nor with Kronan actually, so its proposal was summarily executed. So a strange situation arose, where it was utterly rebellious to eat grots for the vast majority of the time, which had caused no small amount of resentment, but that the number of grots could be controlled, their place reminded to them, and the pent-up frustration of the orcs to be released. For Kronan enacted random feast days, where it was perfectly permissible, nay encouraged, to gorge on the little horrors. But Kronan had ever been more cunning and had his runt herds caged off enough to ensure a return to numbers, along with the constant flow of them from the very soils of Aquilonia, of course. And thus was harmony regained. Enough grots for his uses, the health of the camp and the war, but they were certainly kept in their place. He even instituted a prize system, whereas one grot had a huge collection of teeth sewn into them. Feast days were certainly very popular these days, but I digress. Kronan's mighty cogitation had availed him the cunning to deal with this event without the use of chains grand. He felt confident of this, and thus did he weave his web, the ideas flowing into his mind like flies in a pile of poo. And he was ready. 2 stones, 1 bird. Wait a second. Perhaps that was 2 birds and 1 stone. Kronan was not certain. What he was certain of was that he had just come up with a stonking plan. It was on the dawn of a glorious day that the oddest thing did happen. For Kronan received an embassage from the other War. It seemed a rather un-orky thing to do, if truth be told. It set many an eyebrow aflutter, and Kronan was disquieted by it all, as the scum from the Speed Wars marched into his camp and were led to him. Cutting a short meeting even shorter, the upshot was that Tooth Smasher wished to deal with the issue mano a mano, or more to put it, orky e orky, a one-on-one duel. Of course, Kronan accepted the challenge, but it was so strange. He knew something was amiss. All did. But Kronan had some ideas, already attempting to bash their way into his head whilst the parley went on. Something was very odd about their embassage as well. Something off about the hue of the higher-rank knobs attached to those representing Tooth Smasher. For each War was made up of many a mob and band, and these others were not directly of the opposing big boss, but were present as representatives and eyes for one of the lesser bosses of his opponent's War. Kronan noted it. He would let those annoying buzzing ideas into his mind when he had more time. And thus did the perfect situation arise. For Kronan knew that this duel would be the way in which the squealer was used by his opponent, but it was, as such, the perfect time to reveal that damned squealer, so it could be done with. Thus Kronan had his mighty cogitation that I mentioned earlier, and came out with his cunning plan. And so, Kronan met with each of his big bosses individually, and each was told a different tale. Madnut Krunkelstein, his chief weird boy, well, he was informed that Kronan would be going north to the event. Git Squisher McMurder, he was told that Kronan would be going west to the duel. And Grinner the Backstabber freebooter extraordinaire, had been told that Kronan would be going east. And in this way, as Kronan made the final arrangement with his opposite number by the use of proxies, the place was set. Only Tooth Smasher and Kronan and the respective closest meganobs would be privy to the location. Thus did Kronan have his sneakers, his shady workers, watch the way the war moved, and it was apparent that he had struck on a winner, for two of the bosses did not move at all, just waved him off with a chortle and a "get him good" to send him on his way. But there was one part of his war that had sent out foraging parties that had not come back, little by little sending out their best orcs to mass somewhere. And Kronan would punish them mightily. But first, the duel. And so, the numbers agreed, the forces chosen. Kronan took only his original and most fighty nobs and meganobs and their mobs. Try saying that fast. What many had now come to call his utter Black Legion. And the die was cast. And as he and his men stood their ground, amid the rolling plains of the central prairies of Aquilonia, the first signs of the speed war arrived. Plumes of dust thrown up all around him by the approach of his adversary. The first hove into view were the hovering and prowling deathcopters to check the scene. Then the first wave of warbikes hove into view. Kronan's meganobs and their mobs all stood with their boss, bravely looking at a force easily 5 times their size. None flinched. In fact, most grinned. They were with Kronan, and he always had a trick up his sleeve. But all secretly hoped that there was no secret card this time, no trick, no escape. They all secretly yearned for this to be a straight-up scrap, no matter the odds. The biker sprang forward and made straight for Kronan's lines, but he was ready. As the thrumming and roaring bikers closed, the ranks of the Black Legion opened, and forward came mobs and boys with heavy daka. Tank-buster mobs they were called, and they did exactly what was said on the tin. Well, usually. But the tanks had not yet arrived, so the tank-busters just contented themselves with the aperitif of these smaller morsels. Daka was unleashed the like had not been seen since Kronan's pitched battle against the Humies. The bikers were cut down in their swathes. In less than 10 minutes, Kronan and his boys bellowed a huge victory cry as they looked out on a plain filled with twitching severed limbs, grounded bikes laying on their sides, wheels still turning and churning up the earth. The bikers were gone. As the main force of the speed war came closer, the next wave came in swiftly, for the scream of jet engines was heard rolling across the plains. All looked up for a moment, but there was nothing above them. The clangor was coming from the jet-powered vehicles that now thrust towards his lines. Those and a line of vehicles behind, with heavy Daka of their own. Daka that now started to rake his own tank busters. If Kronan was honest, things could be going better. Kronan looked down the ranks, down the entire front from his position, as head and shoulders taller than any here. And it was going as well as he had thought, but certainly less well than he had hoped. For the Megatrack scrapjets now ploughed into his lines. Knobs were thrown hither and thither, or simply reduced to sprays of offal, coming out in the wake of the devastating charges of the ground vehicles come jets. He was losing a lot of boys, as the scrapjets crisscrossed his lines, going straight through them, and then turning round and coming back again. The Boomdaka snaz wagons had used their considerable Daka to clear away the vast majority of his tank busters, way too early in the fray for Kronan's liking. But a battle was like a twisty-turny thing, and could never be fully predicted. That was usually half the fun of them. Alas, as the scrapjets created channels and gaps in his lines, they were then also driven through by the snaz wagons, whose crews now hurled their burning cocktails into his men. Fire burst amongst his ranks and devoured many a smaller Orky. Of course, the majority of the Orks who counted wore mega armor, so few of those were affected. but it was indeed carnage. As Conan's force shrank in numbers, he motioned for the call to go out to muster and form a circle. And it worked. Well, sort of. Many were far too interested in the fun going on around them, but his elite, they took hold and gathered the best. And so it was that the scrapjets were forced to run rings around them, as any who got too close now met a wall of shields, mega armor, and heavy blasts from combi weapons. Also, as the littler ones had been targeted first, the remains of his knobs were very tough indeed. As scrapjets now found themselves smashed by 100 powered and chain weapons, as Kronan's remaining skilled warriors would merely open their ranks to let the jets through, then close their sides and bash them to pieces, creating tunnels of death as he had ordered. The jets were soon whittled down, and the snaz wagons dared not close now. Alas, this is when Tooth Smasher unleashed the next wave of his speed war. The small island of Kronan's best orcs, mostly in mega armor, stood proud on the plain, being circled by the remaining snaz wagons of the speed war. But the dust they threw up prevented the cunning one from seeing what was coming next. For out of nowhere, great dragsters appeared amidst his lines and shot through them. There was little warning, as they did not just appear before his lines, but amongst them. Out of nowhere, and then skidded and twisted around in the dust, ready to do it all over again. At the same time, the circling convoy of Orky vehicles was joined by custom boom blasters that fired hot metal death at his boys. Their armored-piercing rivets smashed through the mega armor of many of his knobs, sending them hurtling back as they died. Things were certainly looking bad. To the almost universal lament of his boys, Kronan did indeed have a plan for exactly this situation, and it was cunning. As the old axiom goes, to catch a thief or speed freak, one would need a thief or other speed freak. Of course, Kronan did not think of it thus, as he did not know this very human saying. But he simply did things now. The cunning suffused his every fibre, guiding his actions like some form of universal force. Gork and Mork, Kronan would have called it, of course. But it guided him nonetheless. For he had been checking on Dacker von Smashhoven, had been watching him like a starving grot at the last dregs of a bone that is sitting under a mighty orc's rump, and he had been happy with what he had seen. Dacker von Smashhoven was uncomplicated for a boss. He led by example, and he had acted with honor, had executed envoys from the speed war, had claimed he had never been happier, or had more fighting or darker since joining the cunning war. And he simply did not have the guile to lie, was how Kronan saw it. So he banked his life on this gut instinct. For if an orc cannot trust his gut, well, he may as well try growing long luscious locks and debating poetry like an elder. Yuck! And, as previous identified, what better way to beat a speed freak than to use an even speedier freak? Thus it was that the trap was actually sprung. For Kronan had brought every bit as many forces as his opponent. He had just hidden the vast majority of them the one place that his opponent could not, or would not, check. The skies. Kronan reached up with his weapon and fired the signal. A flare went up a perfect green, and revenge was almost instantly dished out. Screeching duckerjets dove down out of the skies, tearing into the ground-based vehicles of the speed war. Blitzer bombers unloaded their cargoes, and entire carpets of explosions tore the ground to pieces, not only exploding on anything they hit, but destroying the planes so that the tracks or wheeled vehicles of the enemy would flounder, and then, at minimum, be overturned or stuck entirely, more often than not. And when a speed freak vehicle was trapped, his Black Legion gained some revenge of their own. It seemed all was going Kronan's way, at last. As planned. Planned. How strange for him to be so satisfied at the results of such a disgusting habit. Yet the results... Truly Gorkamork had blessed him this day. Yet for all his cunning, Kronan was caught unawares. Later, he would fathom why, of course. He had been distracted from the moment, from the greatest homage to his gods. He had failed to watch and enjoy the battle, the fight. And thus it was that the great gods struck him down for his momentary lack of orkiness. A last desperate push from the speed war was in full swing. A last desperate gamble to cut the head from the snake, to take out Kronan himself. The mega knobs about him were cut down by concentrated fire from the booster blasters and the remaining boom duckers. All fire simply bounced clean off the shield Kronan had in his person, of course, not even scratching his mega armor. But it left him Johnny on the spot, and utterly alone. So Johnny no mates as well. None would close with him directly, but nor could his mobs come to his aid, as they were cut off from him. It was then that a huge trike came bearing down on our hero. Atop it was a huge orc, not quite the size of Kronan, of course, but nearly as huge. It had to be Tooth Smasher. And as he came on, he fired all he had at Kronan. The shield took as much as it could, flashing up like a light-bedecked thinkmas or a grotmi display under the torrents of shot, but this was all a distraction. The trike came straight at Kronan, and he rolled to the side, avoiding being smashed off his feet and becoming a very dead skid mark. But in the instant before he could gain his bearings, he was punched back off his feet. A huge snagger claw rammed its way into his chest armor, yet only a few inches into his actual chest, so not much of a bother, except that it was connected to its owner by a metal chain. As the trike went past, Kronan was pulled from his feet and dragged along behind it. Kronan was definitely in a spot of bother. The ranks of his men charged after the retreating remains of Tooth Smasher's tattered force. Its numbers reduced to only a handful by the timely, yet cunningly coordinated intervention of Daka von Smashhoven. Yet with all of his speed, all of his Daka, Smashhoven would not risk the life of his big boss. He dared not strafe or bomb the retreating Tooth Smasher for fear of slaying his lord. And in all of the annals of Orkidom, from the war in heaven until this point, no greater loyalty or love of lord has ever been witnessed by his kind. As Daka peeled off and sped back to the main camp to prepare for the reclaiming of his lord, his boss, his dark, cunning master. And he knew just the orc for the job. Kronan did not know how long it had been. He vaguely remembered the beginnings of the drive back to Tooth Smasher's camp. It was quite a bumpy and definitely ouchy ride. His mega armor had protected him from the vast majority of the damage, but still, he ached all over. He had clearly passed out due to the pain. As he opened his eyes, only one obeyed, only partially. He squinted more than glared at his surroundings. He was immediately met with bright lights and the heartening sound of Daka. It seemed that the enemy had not been able to find the source of his protective field. Despite that he was buck naked, they had missed it. He was pinned to a tree of some sort. What he would later find out was dubbed the Tree of Woohoo, where Tooth Smasher hung all of his best trophies. Well, until they got too pongy. The lights was darker, bouncing off his shields, lighting them up. But this ended soon, when a chorus of laughter rang out. It seemed to be a new, fun hobby of his watchdogs. As the firing ended and the lights concluded, he caught his first glimpse of the home of his enemy. And Kronan was revolted, for he saw things he never thought he would see. Though many in the camp were of a good orky green, some were not. Too many. One would have been too many in his eyes. But there were many here. Orks that were not green. orcs that had spikes and skulls all over them. They were red. They had fallen from the good graces of the great gods Gork and Mork, and had turned into snivelling worshippers of chaos. Disgusting. And they had been accepted by this tooth smasher, infecting his entire endeavour from top to bottom. Repulsive. As Kronan scanned his surroundings bleakly, he was assailed by another horrific realization. He had been bested in battle, yet he was still alive. This was not right at all. Two large shapes moved into his dimming vision, looking at him as they did. One was inarguably Tooth Smasher, but the one next to him, a nasty wretch of red, who stank of something deeply unorky, carrying a staff, not even a real chopper. The orcs discussed him. He gave no indication that he was awake, was listening, and the horror continued. This seneschal of Tooth Smasher, this corrupted whelp, was Tober. He planned to sacrifice Kronan, on Tooth Smasher's behalf, of course, to gain the power to absorb the Cunning War and rule Aquilonia for all time. And it was to be done soon. Now Kronan had mixed feelings about all of this. On the one side, he now knew who the squealer was, for it had been the forces of Drinna the Backstabber he had seen amongst the Speed War. He could not miss their markings if he tried. So the riddle of Squeal was solved. Yet now Kronan could not avoid the reality of his situation. He, the cunning one, would not be slain in battle. He would not lead his war to victory. He would not take Aquilonia and begin his march across the stars. More than this, worse than this, he would not even die in the service of the great gods Gork and Mork. He would be sacrificed to some mewling, weakling, chaos whelp of a god. To say that Kronan was a bit down in the mouth was an understatement. Little did he know that his most loyal servant had set in motion a cunning plan, a set of events which were not to be missed. To be continued in Chains Grand, Ork of Mystery. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed the story so far and will join us on the weekly entries as a result, and will like and subscribe. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.